Lying and Lies to the Sick and Dying, Cicely Bok. Bok's article can be a bit difficult to follow. It's actually taken from several chapters of her book, Lying, Moral Choice in Public and Private Life, from chapters 1, 2, 6, 14, and 15, which is noted in the textbook in a footnote. But what we're going to focus on here is simply Bok's analysis of what lying and deception amount to, and then whether or not lying and deception can ever be justified in the context of medical information and decision making. So Bok looks at the question, is it ever appropriate to lie to a patient about their condition? She wants to know what exactly is the definition of deception and lying. These are actually two different ideas. Deception, she has a more specific definition of lying as opposed to deception. And what excuses are used to justify lying to patients, and do those excuses hold up upon analysis? Defining intentional deception and lying. Bok takes a look at the concept of both deception and lying and wants to give us a clear definition. Is there a difference between deception and lies? If we remember back to the Collins article, Collins seemed to hold that there was in fact a difference, that it was all right to deceive patients in some way, even if I don't outright lie. And so Bok is actually making a distinction here, a fairly clear distinction between what deception is, what a lie is. And while she holds that conceptually these two are different, there's something conceptually different about deceiving someone as opposed to outright lying to them, she doesn't think there's a moral distinction to be made. So when physicians say, well, I never lied to my patient, but I deceived them in some way, I withheld something in some way, according to Bok, that's going to be morally just as bad as if the physician had intentionally lied. So instances in which we do not intend to deceive but state false statements do not count as morally untruthful. So Bok immediately wants to get rid of the idea of mistakes in some sense. So I may make a false statement to you believing it's true. So in that case, I haven't lied or attempted to deceive you in any way. I actually thought the information I had was accurate. So Bok says immediately we can discount those types of statements as lies or deceptions. An intentional deception, though, is the communication of messages meant to mislead or make others believe what we do not believe. So gestures, disguise, inaction, or action, all of those can count as deception. So remaining silent may be a form of deception. Misdirection may be a form of deception. What distinguishes deception from a lie, says Bok, is that a lie is an intentionally deceptive message which is stated. So both in the deception case and a lie case, I am putting forth some information as true which I know is not in fact true. So really lying is sort of a subset of deception. Broadly speaking, there are deceptions, and within the set of deceptions, there are things that constitute lies. Now, remember again, for Bok, it doesn't really matter whether a physician is deceiving or lying, because in both cases, the moral wrongness of those actions is still there, even though we can make a distinction between the two, conceptually. Lying and choice. So what exactly is the problem with lying? We normally think lying is a bad thing to do, but what exactly makes it bad? According to Bok, lying contains with it a coercive element. Now, coercion is just to force somebody to do something against their will. And what Bok states is that lying itself is a way of forcing people to do things. By lying to someone or deceiving to someone, we don't give them the information they need to make a decision, or to make the decision that they would have made had they the true information. So she states, all our choices depend on our estimates of what is the case. These estimates must in turn often rely on information from others. Lies distort this information and therefore our situation as we perceive it, as well as our choices. So when someone lies to me in this way, they can actually, through their lies, cause me to do things I would not otherwise have done, because had I the real information, I would have said, this is what's in my interest, or this is what I choose to do. So lying undermines that idea of choice, that we choose how we want to live our lives, or the types of things we want to engage in, the sort of relationships we want to have. And so Bok says it's this coercive element of lying, this force element of lying, that makes it so morally inappropriate. Perspective of the deceived. Given the problems that lying poses for individual choice, it's easy to see why, from the perspective of those deceived, lying is such a bad thing. For one thing, lying is manipulative. It can be used to manipulate people to do things that you want them to do and that they might not otherwise have done on their own. It also keeps people from making informed choices. So lying generally, outside of even a medical context, is a bad thing because people make choices about a number of things that affect their lives, and lying causes them to make poorly or to choose poorly. And although there are trivial lies, we can never be confident that a lie is in fact trivial. So Bach notes that, a number of us will say, yes, well, people lie all the time, or I'm aware that people tell little white lies all the time. And so shouldn't those be discounted as morally problematic? So the white lie is often what we term a lie that really isn't such a bad thing. So for instance, if I make a comment, or if someone asks me, for instance, how do you like my new haircut or my new shirt? And I may say something that isn't quite true. Maybe I don't like it at all. Maybe I think it's the worst thing I've ever seen in my entire life. I don't need to say that. So maybe I say, oh, that's nice. But what Bach notes is that even though that seems to be an inoffensive sort of lie, the fact is we can never know when a lie is trivial or not. Who knows whether that person uses my comment or depends upon my comment to go to a job interview. And perhaps that shirt or that tie or the hairstyle or something was completely wrong. And so maybe something that would maybe appear trivial at first turns not to be trivial. So Bach says that from the perspective of the deceived, lying is almost always, in fact, a bad sort of thing. The principle of veracity. Given everything Bach has said about the harmful effects of lying and what it does to those who are deceived, it's not surprising that she endorses a principle of veracity that is traced back to Aristotle. And veracity just means truthfulness generally. So the idea is that lying is mean and culpable being morally blameworthy. So if you lie, you are worthy of moral blame, to be held accountable. And so she says the principle we ought to endorse is the idea that truthful statements are preferable to lies in the absence of special considerations. Lying requires explanations, whereas truth ordinarily does not. So the idea is the overriding principle of truthfulness or veracity is what we should normally go by. And if you're going to not be truthful in some way, if you're going to violate this principle, then you're going to need some sort of explanation as to why it's justified. Now, what Bach is going to go on and do is show that, at least in the medical context, and probably most other contexts, is sort of implicitly in her whole discussion here, lying is never going to be justified. So truthfulness, or the principle of veracity, is the one in which, or is the principle which we should endorse on a regular basis as a social norm, as one that we should always at least attempt, that is, to be truthful in our dealings with others. 3 types of excuses for lying. As was mentioned previously, Bach holds that the principle of veracity holds in nearly all situations. That if we're going to violate the principle of veracity, we need to give some sort of reason why our lie is justified. 3 types of excuses for lying are as follows, says Bach. The fault is not really a fault. So some might argue that when they're lying, they're not actually lying. A lie is a joke, an exaggeration, or if a lie cannot be proven to be a lie, then it's not a lie, some might argue. So in such cases, I can be excused for lying because I'm not actually lying, right? It's not really a fault. The second sort of fault exists, but individuals are not responsible. So an individual that never meant to mislead someone, if they're, say, for example, drunk, coerced into lying, incompetent, and so forth, then that doesn't actually constitute a lie. Because a lie has to be something that I do intentionally, that I state something intentionally to mislead. And if I'm not in my right state of mind for some reason, whether it's through coercion or some other effect of a substance, then I can't be held accountable. Finally, there's the lie where the liar admits the lie, accepts responsibility for the lie, but offers reasons that remove some or all the blame. So lie under certain circumstances ought to be allowed is essentially what that person who's lying is making the case for. And it's this third type that really is the kind we find in medical decision making. What Bach needs to do now is show why this third example, the one she's going to focus on in the rest of the article, where the liar admits the lie and accepts responsibility, but offers some reason to remove all or some or all of the blame, Bok needs now to ask whether or not this does in fact allow a physician to lie to patients, whether there can be reasons given such that these types of lies ought to be allowed. And this is where she begins her discussion of paternalism, because lies that are justified are normally justified as being helpful in some way, that the outcome of the lie is such that it increases someone's utility, say, or helps keep someone from being caused some sort of harm. And so in such cases, the lie would be justified. So from this point, Bok wants to take this third notion, this third excuse, and ask whether or not some sort of paternalistic understanding of lying would make someone not culpable for violating the principle of veracity. Paternalism. What exactly is paternalism? Well, just as it sounds, paternalism is normally something we associate with a parent-child relationship. In the parent-child relationship, the idea is that the parent makes decisions that are in the child's best interest. When we talk about paternalism without regard to children, we're normally talking about the decision-making of one adult for another adult against their will. So, to guide and even coerce people in order to protect them and serve their best interests. So whenever we act against someone's will in their best interests, and assuming that that person is an adult that can make their own decisions, we've acted paternalistically. Now, there are several types of paternalism, or several ways in which we can be paternalistic. One can offer guidance to be paternalistic, giving information or giving information in such a way as to lead a person in a certain direction. We can persuade someone to take our advice, or we can force them, or, in the very last case, and the one that applies in our situation here, we can deceive them into doing what it is we want them to do. Now, paternalism is not always unjustified. Paternalism, in other words, is not always a bad thing. And in certain cases, we think that there are legitimate grounds for paternalism. The question, of course, is whether this sort of paternalism in the medical context is ever justified. And what we'll see in our further sort of analysis of paternalism is that Bok holds that it's not justified. And that, in fact, paternalism, when we're talking about relationships between two rational adults, normally results or is a means by which one of the two, normally in this case the physician, can avoid some sort of confrontation. Paternalism continued. According to Bok, lying, even when done paternalistically, that is, for the good of someone else, is not justified. According to Bok, what normally happens is that lying is a means by which physicians and others can actually avoid confrontation. It also is often the case that lying is used to avoid change, or in sort of less noble sort of excuses, it's used to maintain power and control. So ultimately, lying, says Bok, is a means of self-protection and manipulation. When a physician lies to a patient, it's normally the case that such lies are used to maintain control over a situation. In other words, it's a lack of acknowledgement of the other's autonomy, their ability to make decisions for themselves, and so on. And so a lot of times what Bok says is that physicians will avoid telling the truth, not because they believe the patient can't handle it so much, but because they themselves don't want to actually have to confront the situation, that it might in some ways be easier for them to keep this information to themselves. It's also the case, says Bok, that there is a price to being a liar. So when one lies, you need to shore up the lies with more lies, oftentimes, to keep the lie going, and this induces a large amount of anxiety. As we'll note later, that when this sort of paternalism, this sort of lying, is done in the medical context, there are other impacts it has both on the liar and the people around the liar. So not even the patient, but say the support staff of a physician. And we'll talk about that in the section as deception as therapy. Deception as therapy. While it might be assumed that in the medical profession the principle of veracity has some sort of special status, it turns out that in fact it doesn't. And in most moral or most medical codes of ethics, don't in fact place honesty as a central responsibility of the physician. What's normally placed in most medical oaths, including the original Hippocratic Oath and the contemporary version of the Hippocratic Oath, is the idea of beneficence and non-malfeasance. So beneficence is, as we've mentioned before in other sections, to benefit, to do good for someone, and non-malfeasance is not to harm. And those seem to be the overriding principles of the medical profession. So ultimately, given that medical oaths and codes of ethics don't have a strong place in honesty, although more contemporary oaths, versions of the Hippocratic Oath do include it, the physician can ultimately decide what to tell or not to tell a patient as far as their condition is concerned. Now, as I mentioned in the previous slide, deception in a medical context can often cause conflict within a medical group. As your book notes, there are times, for instance, when doctors who are both working on the same case, or doctors, nurses, and other medical professionals may actually disagree as to whether a person ought to be told the truth about their condition. Now, in the context of therapy, what Bock is going to argue is that it turns out that there is no justification, even based on grounds of beneficence or non-malfeasance, that justify deceiving patients about their actual condition. And so, as a rule, physicians should not deceive patients or lie to patients about their condition. The patient's perspective. At this point in her article, Bock now turns her attention to the three main arguments often given for lying to patients. The first is that truthfulness is impossible. As you'll note in the text, since this is being taken from several chapters of a book and combined together, the readings you have don't actually address this sort of problem. Now, truthfulness is impossible could imply any number of things, and I'm only speculating here as to what Bock was discussing. But it's quite possible that truthfulness is impossible may be Bock addressing cases of relativism with regard to truth or extreme skepticism. So there's some people in philosophy who argue that truth is impossible, that there is no definition or standard of truth, and that we can't actually know the truth. So it might be she's making a philosophical argument or talking about objections to the truth in a philosophical sense. There might be some pragmatic problems with truth-telling. So there might be some that hold that truth is a correspondence to something in reality, and so she might be noting those who are skeptical of having any certainty with those sorts of notions of truth. Or in the context of medical decision-making, she may have addressed issues of truth-telling with regard to patients that are incompetent or unable to receive information, such as those in a vegetative state or a comatose or in a coma or something along those lines. So there's any number of things that might be implied there. For our purposes here, you're not actually responsible for that point or that one reason for lying. The other two, though, are both addressed by Bock in her article. Patients do not want the bad news, and this is a la Collins' article. So if you remember back to Collins, he holds that all of the patients that he deals with, of the four types of patients, I should say, that he deals with, not all of them actually want to know the truth or are capable of handling the truth. So even though they may ask to be told the truth, or it may be assumed that they want to know the truth, it turns out that a large group of patients don't really want to know the information, that it's a rare patient that actually wants to know and can handle hearing the truth about their medical condition. The second sort of argument for lying to patients is that truthful information will harm the patient. So these second 2 points actually go together. There's some patients who simply don't want to know. So it might be a question of autonomy. In other words, they've decided, I don't want that sort of information, regardless of whether it harms or not. And then the other sort of argument is one where patients would actually be harmed. And by this actual harm, which we'll mention briefly, the types of things like suicide, or that would cause them to go into a deep depression, or something along those lines. So telling the patient the truth would actually cause real harm, real physical harm, not just some sort of moral harm. Response to patients do not want the bad news. One thing Bock does in approaching the notion of paternalistic sort of deception to patients is to note that the reasons given for deception in therapy, the idea that patients don't want the news or couldn't handle the news, doesn't actually hold up to scrutiny when we look at the facts. So as Bock notes, 80% of patients when questioned want to be told the truth. So understanding the fact that the truth may be distressing, a large majority of patients actually want this to be told to them. They don't want to be deceived. They don't want it kept from them. While there are patients that may engage in some sort of denial, between 15 and 25% of patients, once given the information. What Bok argues is that this sort of denial is a coping mechanism and is only temporary. So while physicians may note that when they relay information to patients, apparently bad information about their health, that these patients will go into denial or be upset or what have you, that's a normal or natural way in which people cope with their situation. So the 5 stages of grief sort of thing is allowed to take place. And what normally happens is that physicians who don't take the time to carefully explain the situation, who don't take time to prepare their patients, actually probably experience this more than doctors that don't, or that do, in fact, prepare their patients for the information. So this 15 to 25%, the vast majority of these, while they may engage in some form of denial, will eventually come to terms with their situation and in fact may then benefit from that information, be able to get their affairs in order or to be able to think clearly about treatment options and things of that nature. So lies place patients in a position where they cannot make choices regarding their health, treatment, non-treatment, and life decisions. So it's actually the case that lies do more harm than good. That it is better to tell patients this because, one, most patients want to be told the truth, and that is their right. That is to treat them or respect them as autonomous individuals with dignity. Those patients that will engage in denial will eventually cope with the situation. And once that happens, the patients are now in a better position to make the sort of informed decisions that they ought to be able to make, that it's their right to make. And so Bok says that the idea that patients don't want the information is just not true, that the vast majority of patients do, in fact, want this information. Response to truthful information harms patients. As I've already alluded to in the previous slide, Bok does not believe that the sorts of harms outweigh the good that comes from telling the patient the truth about their situation. So risks due to sad news, heart attack, suicide, and so forth, are actually very rare sorts of things. So while it may be word of mouth or anecdotal evidence to suggest that telling information to some patients may cause them to have these sort of severe reactions to the information, it turns out that these are actually a very low number of patients actually ever have these sorts of things occur or react in this way. And the benefits of informing patients of the truth is far greater than the liabilities. So the ability of a patient to prepare themselves is one of the benefits of informing patients. That preparation may mean getting their affairs in order, sort of financial. It may be getting their personal life in order, seeing people that they've wanted to see and so forth. Anyone who's had a relative in this situation often finds that people that they haven't spoken to or have spoken to infrequently, they now want to talk to sort of make amends, any of those things that we normally associate with end-of-life sort of decisions and actions. There's also a physiological preparation that some see. So many physicians, many people who study these sorts of things say that when a person is informed of their situation, there's actual physiological reaction, that their body begins to prepare for the inevitable. So especially in cases where it's an end-stage sort of cancer or some other disease like that, that the body actually responds, and not telling the person actually hinders the natural physiological preparations that take place in a person. And patients tend to be more attentive to physicians' instructions when they're told the truth. So imagine you have a poor diagnosis. Something comes across where, unfortunately, something is discovered where a patient isn't doing well. Keeping that information may actually make the patient lax in following doctor's instructions. If they don't know the severity of what's going on, they may think that there's not much they need to do, or they're more liable to not follow the doctor's instructions carefully. And so for all of these reasons that we've mentioned, Bok says that telling the truth to patients is sort of a moral imperative, a moral command. We should not keep this information. The paternalism, lying, is not in fact justified. There isn't a good argument, a good excuse for lying, as there might be in other cases to save someone's life. So in the context of medical decision making, when it comes to the physician-patient relationship, Bok rejects the sort of arguments Collins makes and says that no, in fact, patients deserve the truth in all situations.